Hello and welcome to Todos Somos Marcos. Today I'm very pleased to have a guest who's been on the show a number of times before, Roberto Flores. Welcome, Roberto.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah. Roberto spent 11 months in Chiapas on a Fulbright scholarship studying the feminine factor within the Zapatista movement. Bruce and I visited him down there. We interviewed him at his place in San Cristobal. We went out to Ocosingo. We did a great show over at Palenque. But this is the first we've had a chance to talk since you've been back, so that must have been quite a year, Roberto.
Oh, it was. It was several years piled into one. Yeah, It was a great experience. And I ended up doing a lot more than just the study on women. I think two other big areas that I ended up looking at was the whole question of autonomy as a tool for social change, and the whole question of bilingual education as well.
Bilingual, that is, say, Spanish and the Mayan tongues that are spoken in the area?
That's right. That's right. The indigenous tongues in that area.
Now, did you deal mostly with people in San Cristobal, or did you get to meet and form relationships with people out in the communities as well?
I was very fortunate. I did both. I formed a lot of lasting friendships, I think, great friendships that will last for the rest of my life in San Cristobal and in the communities, both. And I got to meet a lot of the people, ordinary Zapatista people in the Zapatista communities, as well as some of the officially named and elected comandantes and leaders.
And how would you describe the relationship between those two groups? You know, in what sense is a Zapatista community in Chiapas?
Well, it's a very unique type of community, very different from ours here. The Zapatista themselves are an upside-down pyramid. The communities very much control and rule and have the most and last say on major decisions, major guidance decisions, and that's their primary form of organization for social change.
Now, it seems to me that I've read, for instance, in Andrew Oppenheimer's book, Bordering on Chaos, I think was the name of his book, and doesn't he argue in there that, you know, like it's all a Marcos cult, and that Marcos is reading him and some others, I get the impression that Marcos. Now I know enough about the Zapatistas to know that this isn't true, but this contrasting view, is there an element of truth in it?
Well, I think there is an element there in terms of the type of respect that they give a person like Marcos.
Yeah.
And but I think that Oppenheimer was maybe a little upset, maybe just naturally cynical.
That's right. He did have to wait quite a long time for this interview.
A lot of different comments in terms of him having to wait and being very frustrated and upset with Marcos, who he felt was maybe self-glorifying and somewhat arrogant.
Now, clearly, a lot of the importance, some of the importance of the Zapatista movement worldwide does relate to the charismatic and very, expressive character of Marcos. His communiques, which have been read and repeated all over the world, have been very instrumental in formulating the values and views of Zapatismo that so many people worldwide relate to. So he has had that role, but are you saying that at the same time that he's kept true to the vision of ruling by following, and that the community's ultimate decisions are made by communities?
I think it's a process. It's not that simple. It's complicated, complex. I'll give you an example. There were several people who happened to be very close friends of mine, Anna Hoyle being one of them,
I remember
and
Anna.
Pia from Germany.
Yeah, they were both on the show.
Right, and they were in the La Realidad, and they were there together with some of the European organizing committees that ultimately organized the Intercontinental in Spain. and they were discussing the possible structures for the conference and for the Intercontinental Conference. And Marcos was there listening, and Marcos made a comment. He said, "You guys, you're doing everything the same. You already did this last year. You've got the same committees. You structured everything the same. The content is the same. Why don't you guys do something different?" Which might have not been a bad idea, right? And of course, this is Marcos speaking to lay folks that would take his word as gold.
It's important, yeah,
very important.
Sure.
He went back, must have related this to a few of the comandantes, and came back a couple hours later. And he went through a very intense and lengthy apology for having done that.
Really?
And he said that he had gone back, related what he did, and that they had told him civil society has to be democratic. They have to learn from their own experience. It will not develop if they are taking orders from you. You have to go back and tell them that they have to do it the way they feel is important. So here's an instance where he took on a little bit of a elitist role.
Yes, and he got called on it.
And he got called on it. He got checked on it.
That's so interesting, because in activist work here, the different communities that I work with, there's always that tendency for people who, have, for some reason, whether it's ability, position, or whatever, they have a natural leadership role. And without that kind of self-criticism and, looking at how you're functioning, it's easy to fall into those patterns.
Very easy.
And yet it's so true that it's not healthy to democratic work.
Right.
And that if we're interested in building democracy, we have to work on...
There's another example of that. It's very brief. When the decision was made to cut off the negotiations in August of 90, I believe it was August of 96.
That's right.
Marcos was given the order by the communities. It was a community decision, which then went to the CCRI, which then went to Marcos, and Marcos articulated. And this is where Marcos is best. When Marcos is able to articulate the true message of the indigenous and able to translate that into Western language and Western thought, and for Westernized people to be able to understand it, that's where his effectiveness is at maximum.
Well, in that example, the decision to cut off negotiations in August of 96, where do you think that decision originated? You said, was there one person in one community who said, this, we have to stop this. This is going nowhere. Was there a general sense that somebody gave expression to, and then it?
Like I said, it's a complex process. There's a lot of discussion going on at the base, and I think that the experience of the youth that just went and their conference with the base will bring out some of this reality. But the base is in touch with major issues and major questions confronting the Zapatistas, their own communities, on a daily basis, and having discussions on a daily basis, and feedback to the CCRI.
Now, in the Zapatista villages, is it the case that whole territories are 100% Zapatista, or is it more often that you have a Zapatista contingent and, say, a priest contingent in the same town? I know that happens sometimes.
There are, most of the Zapatista communities are full Zapatista communities. Then there are some Zapatista communities that are in contention, almost on an equal level with the PRI.
Like San Andreas or something like that.
San Andres is one that is actually a little bit more Zapatista than not. San Pedro is a good example of a contentious situation there, where they're vying for the mainstream political structure. So there they have what they call parallel governments. They have the Zapatista government and they have the Priista government. And those types of communities.
Now, issue of the base decision making from the base down to the top, from the broad democratic participation as we've discussed, I think this ties in very much with an important political demand of the Zapatistas, one I know that you've been interested in, for autonomy. Now, let's talk about autonomy and what is the nature of autonomy, and first of all, what do the Zapatistas want in the context of Chiapas in this sense, and second of all, what should we all want in our own communities for autonomy?
Autonomy is not a new concept, and it's something that the indigenous can do very well today because they've been doing it for 505 years.
I see.
Yeah. Autonomy was forced on them by separation in the early 1700s, when actually it was earlier than that, when King Carlos V figured out that for the indigenous to live under the encomendado directly,
that is to say a colonial structure of land ownership, and
right.
the Indians owed so much in
Yeah,
service or taxes.
they were given like slaves
Yeah.
to encomendados. So let's say Hernan Cortés was in charge of 10,000 indigenous that lived in his encomienda.
Yeah.
Carlos V figured out that that was a bad system, and that actually what he wanted was to separate the Indians away from the conquistadores, because they were all had many vices, they were criminals, and he understood that.
The conquistadors, not the Indians.
No, the conquistadores. They were ex-criminals and criminals that had come, and they had many vices which they didn't want the indigenous to contract. And so they separated them out, and they put them in what they called aldeas. And some of the indigenous naturally moved into the sierras, away from the conquerors. And so this led to a whole history and laid the basis for this isolation of the indigenous, which then set the basis for autonomous communities that relied very much on themselves to survive, and continued traditional methods of governance. So traditional structures of governance, for instance, councils. The Council of Elders is probably the one that we're most familiar with. But the Zapatistas have councils of elders. They have productive councils, which are in charge of all the productive projects in a community. And then they have councils of the political council, which is a coordinating council of all the councils. That's the coordinating council. Many times the Council of Elders has last say. Many times their role is just advisory. It depends on which community.
I see.
Yeah, and now they have Council of Women, Council on Education. So they have different councils, which becomes their government. The main structural unit is the assembly, where everybody is allowed direct participation.
Yeah, I've certainly read descriptions of that.
Right, so this is what they're trying to reconstruct, an autonomous community, because it's not all that perfect everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's that way in enough communities, the Zapatistas communities in particular, 1,200 of them, that they have now developed autonomous municipalities and 6 autonomous regions, and the political structures that go with that.
Really?
Now, to the indigenous communities, to the Zapatista communities, this is the legitimate government.
Yeah.
And the official government is the illegitimate government. The imposed government is the official government.
Do they want nothing from the official government?
No, they use their structures to engage and interact with the official government.
They still want the official government to give them electricity and
That's right.
do things that we all want.
They know that they still have to have some kind of interrelationship while this official government still exists. But they also understand that this official government is dying, that it's corrupt, that it's illegitimate, that it's won by fraud, that it's that they use things like bribery and threats to get their way, and they know that that is not lasting, and they are willing to wait it out. They've waited 505 years. They're willing to wait 100 more or 50 more.
Now, in early, I think it was in January of '96, when the government and the Zapatistas signed an accord on indigenous rights that subsequently the government basically reneged on and has not honored any of its commitments under it. Now, that included some language about autonomy, did it not?
Well, that is exactly. They're trying to get the official government to understand that what they're setting up as autonomous governments are to be recognized by them. Autonomy in culture, autonomy in language, autonomy in politics, autonomy in economic projects, autonomy in the sense of deciding what occurs to the land that they're on. All those questions are questions that they want the official government to recognize. And it's a lot easier for them to then continue to develop that structure which they feel is not only traditional, but necessary to deal with neoliberalism, with the ills for to be able to protect themselves, for self-defense, for survival, and beyond that, to offer it as a model for the rest of the world to follow.
And let's think about it in that sense. Now, for instance, let's take an issue of land use and forest preservation. Now, some of the Zapatista territory is, if I'm not mistaken, some of the last remaining rainforest in that region. It has, incredibly important diversity of wildlife and plant life and the jungle and the forest, and yet under population pressures and being pushed off, again as I understand it, pushed off traditional lands into more marginal lands that could certainly threaten the ecology of the region. Now, should a community by itself be making decisions on land use? For instance, we're going to cut the forest for charcoal, or should these decisions be made, on a more national or even global? And how does that, how does the concept of autonomy relate to issues like this?
The concept of autonomy is not a separationist concept. It is a concern for the whole. It is very much taking into account that they are part of Mexico, part of a larger whole, and they want to build this autonomy in harmony with what is best for the whole. So they are very much into consulting, into making decisions that affect regions on a regional basis, into making decisions that are even local decisions, but that would affect regions on a regional basis.
Of course, I didn't want to imply that the government of Mexico or any of our governments are doing a particularly good job by themselves of managing resources, land use,
and it's
such.
not the indigenous that we really have to worry about in terms of destroying the biospheres and
of course not.
And the environment.
Of course not. Now, how, in the U.S., where we've had the reservation system, at least in 48 states, I think it's been different in Alaska and Hawaii. Is this a model for autonomy?
It is one model, and it's not a very good one. And I mean, we can see the results of that model.
Yeah.
I think that what happened here is that the people were disempowered, disconnected, isolated. And they probably, the Mexican government, would like to do the same.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, they offered that as one of the solutions to the demand for autonomy. So it is a model that has destroyed the indigenous communities, the relocations, the taking them away from arable lands, the total superimposition of federal laws over community laws are things that have completely destroyed the indigenous communities here.
Now here we also see numerous cases of Indian tribes who are arguing for autonomy, whether it's to run casinos or to, I know there's one in the Northwest that has been trying to get permission to harvest a few whales a year to restore that indigenous part of their culture. And so there is, there is the concept of autonomy for Native peoples here in the United States as well. But what I wanted to get at is this a concept that has more general application besides indigenous people? Should we all have some autonomy in our communities and our lives?
That is exactly my point and my stress in terms of applying some of the main and general principles of the revolution in Mexico to here and now USA.
Yeah.
I believe very much that we can apply to a very general and large degree the concept of autonomy. The whole question before us today is how do we survive, and how do we not only survive, but how do we contribute to the reconstruction of our societies that are getting dismantled and decimated by the impacts of transnationalism and neoliberalism. That's the question that they were facing. And that's why I think that their suggestion that autonomy is an appropriate response to today's societal ills is very legitimate. I think it can be applied here in a very broad sense. Yes. So, for instance, in the barrios, we have these communities that are decimated. You have gang warfare. You have a dilapidated housing. You have inferior education. You have all the things
serious
that
problems.
When you go through, if you ask anybody in the barrio community, what problems are you facing? They come up with the 12 same demands that the indigenous people do in Chiapas.
Food, housing, education, employment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Dignified jobs, housing, and so on. It's the same neoliberalism or transnationalism that's impacting on us in a slightly different form, in a different context, in a slightly different context. But if you go to any community and do an investigation of what issues are affecting that community, you will invariably find 4, 5, 6 committees that are community-based. So in general, it's this whole question of self-governance. And I think that one of the historical points that signaled a wanting to systematize this whole question of autonomy was when the indigenous realized that the governments not only did not understand them, not only negated and marginalized them, but even in their efforts to do something good for them, they didn't know how. So the same thing applies for us here. We're in a situation where a lot of our issues are issues that not only do they not want to solve, but even if they
wanted
did,
to, they
don't know how, and they couldn't. So we have to then, autonomy points at us taking on the responsibility now to form our own micro-governments within communities, made up and coming out of the different struggles that exist at this point. You don't have to go out and create this thing. It's already gestating. It's already occurring. We just have to recognize where it's being born and help it, nurture it to develop to its highest level. Not many people let it develop to its highest level.
Now, last week I taped a show with Blaise Bompain about Colombia, and I asked him, what is the peaceful solution for Colombia? He stressed the UN, the involvement of the UN. Now, and I think that he's absolutely right, and I think that this widely applies, that on some issues, in some areas, we need world government, and in some issues and in some areas, we need local autonomy. And in some areas, the nation state is going to have a continued role, but probably not the only role, and perhaps not even the main role. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's going to be some kind of a balance. There's going to be a balance between international, because we live in one globe, and we have to coordinate. Because what one country does affects the other country.
Sure, and environmental.
It's all interrelated.
Yeah.
But we need to reach that balance where the local autonomy is not violated.
Yeah.
And where the local autonomy becomes the basis for that respect, that democratic respect that is necessary at both the nation-state level as well as the international level.
Well, I sense from you something of an optimism that this is possible, that this is something we can do, and that these are exciting, creative times. And I share that.
Definitely so.
So, yeah. Welcome back. Thanks a lot, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Quiero cambiarlo todo porque amo a mi pueblo y el sudor de sus trabajadores, que abonan los cielos de mi patria, donde cosechan el maíz, el frijol, la papa y todo el verdadero alimento. Quiero cambiarlo todo porque amo al campesino, que labrando la tierra cosecha alimento, que también se alimentan los embarazados vivos, que solo comen como puercos. Quiero cambiarlo todo porque amo a los obreros, que también están al servicio de la máquina, y con la unión de todos le romperemos la madre al rico. Quiero cambiarlo todo porque amo a un mundo donde el que haga pan pueda también comerlo, donde el campesino se convierte en jardinero de la vida y no de la muerte, donde el obrero forje hierros para el placer del que trabaja, no del haragán aventurero y cochino que solo come. Por eso quiero cambiarlo todo, porque amo al ser humano, me amo a mí y a la vez a ustedes, compañeros. Gracias.